orange, diaper-clad facsimile of Donald Trump floated over London on Friday as the real US president walked back criticism of his British hostess that he made the day before. Mr. Trump met with Prime Minister Theresa May to watch a military exercise, then held one-on-one talks with her at the prime ministerial country residence, Chequers. At a news conference, he said the US supports the British people's decision to realize full self-government as it negotiates an exit from the European Union, and that he looks forward to a post-Brexit US-UK trade deal. On Thursday, The Sun newspaper published an interview with the US president in which he accused Ms. May of ruining the Brexit process, saying her soft Brexit blueprint would probably kill any future US trade deals. At Chequers on Friday, Ms. May said her plan actually provides the platform for Donald and me to strike an ambitious trade deal, adding that it is all of our responsibility to ensure that transatlantic unity endures. Meanwhile, in London, protesters deployed a 6-meter-tall blimp lampooning Mr. Trump, part of the wave of Friday protests across the UK against Mr. Trump's visit. The demonstrations target the president on issues ranging from immigration and race relations to women and climate change. The US president arrived in Britain from a NATO summit that ended in chaos, with Mr. Trump claiming member states caved to his demands to spend more on defense, while other leaders disputed that any nation promised more than what they already agreed to 4 years ago. Mr. Trump will spend the weekend in Scotland before his final European stop, Helsinki, where he meets Russian President Vladimir Putin. The meeting has many NATO members worried that the two will strike a deal that compromises European security. Monday, London, days before playing host to Mr. Trump, British Prime Minister Theresa May was fighting for her political future in a feud with her cabinet ministers over Brexit strategy. On Sunday and Monday, 3 ministers quit. First, David Davis, who had been in charge of talks to take Britain out of the European Union, then Steve Baker, a junior cabinet minister in the Brexit department, then the biggest of them all, Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, who is considered a major rival to Ms. May for the party leadership. Their departures heightened friction between members of the Conservative Party cabinet who want a complete break with the EU and those who want to keep some economic ties, like the customs union. Ottawa, Mr. Trudeau set out from Ottawa for Riga, the Latvian capital. Canadian soldiers entered the country as part of Operation Reassurance, a NATO mission to deter Russian interference in the Baltic region. Tuesday, Latvia. After arriving in Latvia late Monday night, Mr. Trudeau met Tuesday with Prime Minister Maris Gusinskis, then announced that Canada's NATO commitment in the country would be extended to March 2023. He also said Canada would increase its deployment from 455 soldiers to 540. Later in the day, Mr. Trudeau met with Latvian President Raimons Vidžonis, visited a military base in Adazi and attended a candlelight vigil at a Latvian memorial to fallen soldiers. Washington, Mr. Trump, preparing to set off for Brussels, fired off a series of tweets accusing NATO members of shirking their responsibilities to pay into the organization and making the US bear the disproportionate cost. Wednesday, Brussels. Mr. Trump's morning in the Belgian capital began with a breakfast meeting with NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg, which got unusually tense when he accused Germany of being in Russia's thrall. "I have to say, I think it's very sad when Germany makes a massive oil and gas deal with Russia where we're supposed to be guarding against Russia," Mr. Trump said, apparently referring to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from Russia to Germany's Baltic coast. "We're supposed to protect you against Russia, but they're paying billions of dollars to Russia and I think that's very inappropriate." Mr. Stoltenberg pushed back, stressing that NATO members have been able to work together despite their differences. As she arrived at NATO headquarters, German Chancellor Angela Merkel rejected Mr. Trump's remarks about being a captive to Russia, reminding him that, having been born in pre-Cold War East Germany, and she knew what it was like to see at least part of her country under Moscow's thumb. Later, she and Mr. Trump met face-to-face and discussed investment, trade, defense and migration issues. Afterward, Mr. Trump described it as a great meeting, adding, We have a tremendous relationship with Germany. Canada is projected to spend just over 1.2% of gross domestic product on defense this year, well below the 2% target. But in Brussels, Mr. Trudeau said that his country plays a prominent role in NATO missions and is investing heavily in new military equipment. Before Mr. Trump's breakfast meeting, Mr. Trudeau announced Canada would take the lead of NATO's new military training mission in Iraq, and is prepared to offer up to 250 troops. "We have to build that democracy and strengthen it," Mr. Trudeau said at a German Marshall Fund event on the sidelines of the summit. "Those sorts of tangible elements are at the heart of what NATO stands for. You can try and be a bean counter and look at exactly how much this and how much money that, but the fundamental question is what you're doing actually making a difference?" Later Wednesday, Mr. Trudeau met Mr. Trump on the summit's margins for an informal chat about trade, their first face-to-face meeting since June's G7 summit in Quebec. The conversation was focused on the North American Free Trade Agreement and the recent election of a new Mexican president, a spokeswoman for Mr. Trudeau said. Thursday at Brussels, Mr. Trump's second day at the NATO summit featured similar rhetoric to the first. In a series of tweets, he singled out Germany, the second biggest contributor to NATO's common budget, saying it and other wealthy nations needed to pay more. NATO leaders held an emergency meeting to address Mr. Trump's criticisms. Afterward, Mr. Trump said they had caved to his demands and made significant pledges to increase spending, though he did not specify which countries had committed to what. "I told people that I would be very unhappy if they didn't up their commitments," an Italian president told reporters at a news conference. "I let them know that I was extremely unhappy," he said, but added that the talks had ended on the best of terms. "It all came together at the end. It was a little tough for a little while." But France's President Emmanuel Macron disputed whether Mr. Trump talked as tough as he says he did. President Trump never at any moment, either in public or in private, threatened to withdraw from NATO, Mr. Macron said at a news conference. Mr. Macron also disputed Mr. Trump's claim that NATO allies have agreed to boost defense spending beyond 2% of GDP. Mr. Trudeau, for his part, said Canada was already working toward increasing its military spending through a 10-year plan announced in June 2017. London. Mr. Trump's arrival in London was quickly overshadowed by things he said back in Brussels to The Sun, a British tabloid newspaper. In an interview published Thursday, Mr. Trump took direct aim at his British hosts. He accused Ms. May of ruining her country's Brexit plan, saying her version of separation from the EU is a much different deal than the one the people voted on in the 2016 Brexit referendum. He said Ms. May's Brexit strategy would endanger future US-UK trade deals. "If they do a deal like that, we would be dealing with the European Union instead of dealing with the UK, so it will probably kill the deal." He praised Boris Johnson, who had resigned as Foreign Secretary days earlier. "I think he would be a great Prime Minister. I think he's got what it takes. I think he is a great representative for your country." He blamed recent terrorist attacks in London on Mayor Sadiq Khan, who is a Muslim. The president claimed Europe is losing its culture because of immigration from the Middle East and Africa. Britain's vented anger at Mr. Trump at his helicopter flight on Marine One leaving from the ambassador's residence. Demonstrators jeered and banged pots and pans, and another group of protesters lined roads near the palace. Some of their signs read "Dump Trump, lock him up and there will be hell to pay." Police worked overtime, their days off cancelled. The US president's first official function in Britain was an evening reception at Blenheim Palace, birthplace of Winston Churchill. The outdoor arrival ceremony at Blenheim, Mr. Trump wore a tuxedo and First Lady Melania Trump a butter yellow, chiffon, off-the-shoulder gown, was a grand affair marked by a military band and bearskin hats, hundreds of business leaders in black tie and gorgeous setting sunlight. Friday. London. After lambasting his British host the day before, Mr. Trump started his Friday with Ms. May, watching a military demonstration at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. The event was closed to the media. The two later travelled to Chequers, the Prime Minister's country retreat, where the two met for one-on-one talks followed by a news conference. There, Mr. Trump walked back his comments to The Sun. "This incredible woman right here is doing a fantastic job, a great job," he said. "Unfortunately, there was a story that was done which was generally fine, but it didn't put in what I said about the Prime Minister, and I said a tremendous thing. It's called fake news." Ms. May praised the strength of the US-UK bond, but in a gentle rebuke to Mr. Trump. She said it is all of our responsibility to ensure that transatlantic unity endures. In London and dozens of other cities across Britain, protesters rallied to speak out against the president's visit. Hundreds crowded in Parliament Square under a balloon depicting Mr. Trump as a screaming baby. Some 16 balloon minders in yellow vests identifying themselves as babysitters minded lead lines to the balloon as the curious gawked and took pictures. How it started. NATO is a military alliance forged in the years after the Second World War, amid fears that the post-war Soviet Union would move the Iron Curtain further into Europe. Canada, the United States and 9 European nations were NATO's founding members, while the USSR set up a rival defense alliance called the Warsaw Pact. After the Soviet Union collapsed, NATO's membership grew considerably, and it now has 29 member states. Tensions with Russia. In 2014, tensions between NATO and Moscow reached a new post-Cold War high because of a Russian-backed separatist uprising in eastern Ukraine, followed by the annexation of Crimea from Ukraine. Western nations saw the pattern of Russian expansionism extending to regions of Georgia, and potentially the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. NATO began a mission to defend those countries called Operation Reassurance, which Canadian troops are still a part of. Tensions with Trump. When NATO's conflict with Russia first escalated, then US President Barack Obama was strongly critical of his Russian counterpart's expansionist aims. But during and shortly after the 2016 US election, Donald Trump was more dismissive of NATO. He said the alliance was obsolete, accused other NATO members of not paying their fair share, and suggested that renewing ties with Russia was a good idea. He walked back the obsolete comment in 2017, and his administration tried to tread lightly on the Russia file amid investigations of Moscow's ties to the Trump presidential campaign. But last month, Mr. Trump disrupted the first day of the Group of Seven summit in Quebec by suggesting that Russia should be readmitted. Soon after, Washington and Moscow struck a deal to bring Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin together for talks in Helsinki on July 16. What Mr. Trump will say in Brussels about Russia is anyone's guess, but it has the potential to sow further division in the group. Tensions over money. Mr. Trump's criticism of NATO has also centered on money. Member countries agreed in 2014 to spend 2% of their GDP on defense within a decade. The US far exceeds the target, but most countries haven't met it yet, and Canada is near the bottom of the list in terms of spending by GDP. Last summer, Defense Minister Harjit Sajjan announced a $62.3 billion, 20-year spending plan that would raise defense spending to 1.4% of GDP by 2024-25. In recent months, Mr. Trump has escalated criticism of NATO allies, and has repeated some misconceptions about how NATO funding works, falsely suggesting that the nations with smaller defense budgets owe the US money. There is no such debt to the US or to NATO. The 2% target is not a commitment, not a direct contribution to NATO, not a payment owed to the US, and not something that alliance members pledge to achieve immediately. The 2% target is separate from NATO's common budget, contributions to which are decided based on the size of the member nation's economy. The United States makes up about 22.1% of the common funding. Saturday to Sunday, Mr. Trump and his wife, Melania, are spending a private weekend in Scotland, where he owns 2 golf courses. Monday. The last stop on Mr. Trump's trip is Helsinki, where he is holding bilateral talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Associated Press, with reports from Reuters, the Canadian Press and Globe staff,